I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Thank you for joining me on the season finale of Season 2 of This Is Not a Pipe podcast. I'm honored today to be able to speak with Heather Ann Thompson, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Blood in the Water, the Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and its legacy. First off, however, I want to say a giant thank you to everyone who has been listening for 2 years now. And if you've just started or you've recently found this podcast, I really appreciate the reviews, the direct messages, the advice, the questions, the engagement that I've seen, and that seems to continue to pick up almost on a daily basis. Thank you, everybody, as well as all of the amazing authors that I've had the privilege of speaking with over the last 2 years. Season 3 will be just as amazing, I promise you, and will be out beginning in August. For June and July, however, we'll go on a bit of a hiatus. Without further ado, let me introduce Heather Ann Thompson, professor of history at the University of Michigan, and the winner of what seems like millions of prizes for her work, including the Pulitzer, the Bancroft Prize, the Ridenhour Prize, the J. Willard Hurst Prize, and many, many others. In this interview, she provides insights to her methodology, the way in which she organized this 13-year project, how she went about finding and corroborating evidence, and the importance, ultimately, of telling this story. Of course, don't forget to check out the website or the show notes to see what Heather recommends in terms of readings. She's provided 5 books, like all of my guests on the show. Heather, first of all, thank you so much for being on the show and speaking with me today. I think we can jump right into it. At the beginning of your book, you talk about the first few Freedom of Information Act requests that you sent out, and how eventually you found this treasure trove of information and were able to build this incredible work that shines a spotlight onto something that people really didn't know. While Attica is a famous name based on the riots, the actual events were very much obscured, and you were able to find out quite a bit. But at the beginning, you didn't know that necessarily. I'm sure you didn't know that this would eventually be more than 700-page Pulitzer Prize-winning work. And so I'm wondering if you can take us through the very beginning when you started to send out those Freedom of Information Act requests.
Well, of course, early on, you're just trying to accumulate as much information as you can and, never quite certain where it's going to end up, if not the cutting room floor. But I knew enough to know that there had been a lot of trauma at Attica. Certainly, many people had been killed and tortured. And so I suspected that it was really essential to get law enforcement records, or certainly what the FBI knew, and ideally what various state as well as federal officials might have known or how they might have been involved. And so I literally filed Freedom of Information requests from every governmental agency you might imagine. I mean, the obvious ones such as the FBI and local police, but also, various presidential collections, the Attorney General, the Department of Defense, the Justice Department. I really tried to think as broadly as possible. Remarkably, it turned up very little, which made me very suspicious because I just couldn't believe that, a lot of these institutions didn't have some connection with Attica. For example, I knew there had been law enforcement on the ground from the federal government, so where were the records? Initially, I just filed them pretty basically, wanting to know anything to do with prison uprising at Attica. And as I got more into the project, those requests became more specific the more that I knew. For example, I wanted to know about medical testing at Attica, and I knew that there had been a doctor there who had worked at a hospital in Rochester, so I did a Freedom of Information request from the National Institute of Health to see if he'd gotten any grants that might have had to do with Attica. And so it really was just a scattershot trying to get information from everybody. Notably, the FBI is where I got, at least initially, the most pages, although the more specific I got, a lot of the requests I made really dried up because, I suspected, frankly, I was getting closer to what folks really didn't want me to look at.
And so when you started off, did you have a sort of standard request for anything to do with Attica, or did you have specific requests for specific places that you were going to send one at a time? So in other words, did you sort of cast a wider net and then get more narrow, or how did you start with the process of sending them?
Yeah, absolutely. I started off quite broadly. I didn't know enough myself to know how to narrow it down to specific names or even specific case numbers or whatever. But, the more that I dug myself, the more information I had, which made it much easier to send more targeted requests. But, again, the more targeted they became, in fact, in one case, I was filing requests from the state of New York, and I actually knew for a fact what boxes the information I wanted was in. And those were denied. And so that's when I really suspected that we were in trouble in terms of, the public's right to know what's happening in public institutions.
I'm curious if you have any advice for anyone who might be trying to file something like that, like a Freedom of Information Act request, especially if you're denied. I mean, did they deny it on the grounds of some kind of confidentiality, or did they simply say no with no explanation? And then how did you proceed?
Well, I think that the more dangerous response is we have some things. And then you never know what's missing. You never know, why they're redacting this versus that. And then a lot of times it's privacy, or in my case, they always say that they can't disclose grand jury material, even though, for example, in the request I made of the state, I knew for a fact that I wasn't requesting any grand jury material because I had the state index. So I knew what was in there, which I was asking for. So I guess the advice is that you always have to just keep at it, because the other interesting thing is that record people change. And so you might file a Freedom of Information request in, 2019 and get rejected. And, you can file the same thing, in 2021, and it might turn up something. And sometimes it will turn up the exact same pages, but with different things redacted, which is quite humorous to me.
Yeah, did that actually happen to you?
Oh, yeah. And in fact, the funny thing would be if I'd get material from one agency and material from another agency, and each of those agencies had redacted them differently. So you could kind of piece it together, what was in there. But I think that the overall message to anyone who wants to work, I would say really on any period, is interesting. It's not just the modern period, that, we're trained as scholars to go where the sources are. And at least for historians, but not exclusively historians, those are archives. And the experience of working on this book really showed me that, yeah, you go to the archives, but that is, in its weird way, a very distorted source, because, it's what was collected, it's what folks are willing to have you see. And so I feel that every scholar, when piecing together one of these stories, has to begin with the premise that, you're an investigator and you have to kind of imagine really creatively, who would have information on this, and, who was there, what kind of agencies might have interfaced with this, what kind of, which people were in office when it happened, and, was there a union that might have records because of grievances filed? Was anyone a veteran that Veterans Affairs might have records? And it really does require a different kind of recovery. Frankly, I knew as a trained historian.
It's amazing the quantity and quality of the materials that you were able to acquire over what sounds like more than a decade of working on this book and of searching for these things. If you could go back mentally to where you began, I'm curious if you thought that you would eventually, if you kept persisting, get something to this extent, or did it grow and then you realized there was more to it? Like, were you anticipating anywhere near the amount of information you did end up getting?
No, and in fact, the happenstance by which the book became as long as it was and take as long as it did is something I think a lot about. I mean, part of the issue here is that it's just my personality. It's a little bit dogged. I won't walk away from it if I feel like there's something still to know. And, of course, that can be a real liability, because it's hard for me to know or feel good about finishing a project, because I always feel slightly suspicious that there's something around the corner I should have looked for or seen. In this case, though, it was, that was definitely the case. I kept worrying that I just wasn't fully getting the picture. But mostly it was just the sense that it just could not be that we could have had this, massive uprising at a prison and so many people were killed and so many prisoners were the ones that were held responsible for it, even though the shootings and the torture and the trauma were all at the hands of law enforcement. And so I just couldn't rest with this idea that was just inevitable or natural. I wanted to know how it worked. How did that cover-up happen? How were these people actually let off the hook? And so that kind of, I guess, stubbornness is what led me to keep pushing and pushing. And it's alarming because it means that we have deadlines. We have a certain number of pages that we can finish that an editor will let us publish. And in my case, I was very lucky because they were patient with me and ultimately were willing to publish a long book. That's not always the case. It's frustrating because some of these things do require years to kind of follow the threads. It's a ball of twine that you're constantly unrolling, and it just takes you down the road in paths you had not at all expected.
A quick question about that. Would you say that you stayed on this project for, was it a decade or so?
13 years.
13. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for those 13 years, of course, you're doing other things. I'm sure you're doing service and you're teaching and you're, living your life and having a family.
Right.
Would you say that you stayed sort of steady on this book, putting in a certain amount of hours per week, perhaps? Or did it come in kind of ebbs and flows where you were really dedicated to it and then maybe months went by without doing much? How did the workflow go?
Well, it was definitely the latter. I mean, the reality is, yes, I'm a professor, I teach, I have 3 kids, I lived in 3 different cities over the course of this book and different jobs. So it definitely ebbed and flowed. And in the middle of it, I wrote the article, Why Mass Incarceration Matters. So meanwhile, I felt like I was really studying and trying to make sense of the carceral state as its kind of own project. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I mean, there was times when I was working on it intensely and times when it would kind of fall to the wayside. But it's interesting because I'm actually very grateful for that. Had I actually turned over a manuscript in 2006 or 2007 when it was actually due, it would have not been this book. Mm-hmm. This is the kind of book that needed time. I needed time to sit with it and think about what the story was, but it also required time in terms of really having people willing to talk to me. A lot of the research credit here doesn't go to me at all. It goes to the survivors with whom I had to build relationships that, they would share their stories with me and talk to me. History always is going to get out some way, somehow, because it has its victims, its survivors, its truth tellers. And so that took time. That was nothing that could have been rushed. And so maybe, these kinds of books are not the best books for a first book. Mm. They do tend to wander, but they're really important to write because the pressures of our profession to churn things out quickly, it doesn't just have a personal cost. It actually has, I think, a knowledge base cost. It really does change what we collectively know about things because we've rushed to get to the answer, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and that's such an excellent point. I was thinking about this. This is a more than 700-page book, winner of a Pulitzer Prize, but it's also just sort of one line on a CV compared to possibly like 5 journal articles or 20 presentations or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, so when we're looking at quantitative analysis of CVs and all that kind of thing, the quality of this could easily be lost. So that's a great point.
Well, and I will tell you that did not escape me at all as a professor, trying to come up with full and also depended upon a merit raise schedule every year, as we all are. And, that was definitely, I was acutely aware of that. And again, it's interesting because that was also probably why throughout the process of writing the book, I felt so committed also to, to getting another article written and to go to many conferences and do conference papers and, to remain a scholarly citizen beyond the book. And that itself is difficult, particularly in institutions where folks have to teach so many classes, mm-hmm. do so much service. And so there's many things working against us doing that investigative kind of research that needs to go into books like this. And at the end of the day, it is a line on the CV. It is the one book that you wrote that year, and many people wrote books that year. And so you can't do it for those reasons. It really has to be a labor of love, which is why picking topics is so important.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have to be really engaged in what you want to write about to live with it for a year, let alone 13.
This topic in particular, I found it really amazing that the cover-up that you were able to unpack and get into in many ways that were hidden from people. I mean, I think it's very tempting to think of the current federal administration and the current 24-hour news cycle and fake news and all of this stuff as a very contemporary thing. And so I was almost taken aback by what was happening in the 70s, sounding almost exactly like what we hear in the news today. I'm wondering if you saw any important parallels or maybe important differences between this era of the 70s and what was going on compared to what a lot of us are seeing today.
Well, it's funny that your question really takes me back to what we were discussing earlier about the ways in which these things are, the ways in which they're covered up, and then, you know, you have to just go at a different path to find out what happened, the non-archival path, or at least the traditionally archival path to find out what happened. When you and I were discussing it, we were talking about specifically in terms of a book on the 70s. But in fact, working on Attica really made me feel very, nervous about every book we've ever written on any period.
Yeah.
Because what it really shows is that, yes, it's happening today. It was happening in the 70s. And you can be darn sure that, for example, with the, Tulsa riot, in the 20s, or Chicago 1919, or any number of critical moments in the past, we also have no clue really what was going on, because those archives were just as curated as those are today, and as the Trump administration is currently curating its archive to hide as much as it reveals. It's very sobering, I think, as a scholar to reckon with that. To think about all that we don't know rather than kind of feel good about what we do know. I have to say that for me personally, the real resonance was that when the book came out, there was a spate of prison uprisings across the country. And of course, there are still myriad. And this week alone in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, people are banging on the windows because they're freezing and they're trying to call public attention to it. And I was just mostly struck, it just kept hitting me that, like in the 70s, today our prisons are public institutions, and yet we can't get inside of them. We can't verify the conditions that folks inside tell us are horrendous. We can't do much, because even though we foot the bill for these horrendous institutions, we have no control over them. And that includes the records. So right now at this detention center in Brooklyn, the men inside have been saying, we don't have any blankets, we don't have any heat, we don't have any water, we don't have any electricity. And the Department of Corrections literally told the judges, that's not true. They do have heat, they do have blankets, they do have electricity. And it was a bald-faced lie. And the only reason we know that is because the prisoners inside, or in this case, jail detainees, they haven't even been convicted, are banging on the windows, and their family members are on the outside, and they're having a dialogue through these windows so that they know what's happening. And that is just an eerie shade of Attica, because for years, for decades, those guys tried to tell the world what was happening to them, and literally no one believed them. Because the Department of Corrections said nothing's happening here. And that's sobering. That's actually what's led me from the book to write popular articles whenever I can when these things happen, or to be on Democracy Now!, or to go on The Daily Show or whatever, because I really want to send this message to take seriously what's happening today, that's really the lesson of Attica. We got to pay attention. I did a piece in the New York Times after the recent Lee riot in South Carolina, for exactly that reason, because the one thing I knew before I fully tracked down the story was that whatever the Department of Corrections was telling the media was not true.
Yeah.
And I knew that much. That's all I needed to know to dig further.
I mean, this is 40, 50 years ago we're talking, and then, of course, there's much further history that you could look at. I'm wondering if you, at some point, just thought, not only is this an uphill battle, but this is almost unwinnable because it's always, seems to at least, have happened and continues to happen.
Right.
How do you not get into a sort of pessimism that prevents you from working like you are?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that there's a whole other discussion to be had by folks who are working on these projects. You know, you always get to that point where you're wondering kind of what is the point?
Mm-hmm.
Because it feels sometimes like no matter how much you uncover, you know, there's an apathy or there's 10 times more things yet to be covered up. It does feel a bit like that. But on the other hand, I will say that one of the most amazing bits about the response to the book was that it made me feel, wow, you know, the endorsement of this book actually means that people will read it, and people have read it. And it has made people, I think, more skeptical when they turn on the news and read about what's happening in prison. I think it has contributed. And I say that most humbly, you know, but I think so. I think so based on the emails I get and the letters I get, and certainly from the letters from the inside I get, you know, and then you're reminded that public education is very important. And who better to contribute that than folks who are willing to really dig and take the time to do it? You know, journalists do an extraordinary job at this, but folks who have a few years to actually work on a project can contribute a different level of detail that matters. And I think making our work accessible is what makes it feel less depressing and overwhelming, and makes it feel like perhaps it shifts or moves at least a few needles within public discourse. When the book got the awards that it did, including the Pulitzer, everyone said, you know, how did you feel? How did you feel? Well, of course, I was flabbergasted and stunned personally, but I was also so moved emotionally. And the reason is that I had spent years with people who were telling me their stories and had not been believed. And the one thing I knew that those awards would help was to bring attention to their stories. And that just kind of it literally brought me to tears at the time, because I couldn't quite, you know, that was just so amazing to me. And none of that had to do with personal gain at all. It actually had to do with that fighting back the pessimism that you identified.
It's a powerful example, like you say, of actually getting a message or a story out there. And I want to ask you about that. Obviously, it's a well-researched scholarly work, but it's also a nonfiction narrative that has a lot of literary conventions, I would say. Like, I think you could easily see plot twists and foreshadowing and other types of writing more common in fiction. How did you go about sort of telling this story? And did you kind of weigh the pros and cons of how you would talk about it? Because, of course, it doesn't read like a dissertation or a really obscure journal article. But it's also not so tense that it sounds like a Dan Brown novel or something like that.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah. No, but it's engaging much more than the average academic article, but it's not over the top engaging where it's like a plot twist on every page. So
right.
I'm wondering how you measured that or how you balanced that.
Well, I have to say that's another one of those things, like the research, like the Freedom of Information request saga, that I was feeling my way as I went along. Let's be clear, you know, we're not trained to write that way.
Mm-hmm. In fact, sometimes we're discouraged, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, you know, historians have never met a footnote that they don't like and a quotation that they won't use. And so for me, it was very, very difficult. It wasn't actually till taking on this book that I realized that I had never really been taught to write, certainly been taught to research. Mm-hmm. And I'd certainly been taught how to make a tight argument and to use words to marshal a point and to reveal something via evidence. But I had never really had to think about writing as an art or as a craft. And so, you know, I had to often just start to read more, you know, read novels, read nonfiction, or even, you know, historical fiction that I really like, to kind of think about, why do I like this? Why am I engaged with this story? I mean, I discovered, for example, that real writers rarely use descriptive adjectives, like, you know, things were terrible, things were brutal. They instead use a story or a metaphor or something that evokes how terrible it was. And that was, that was above my pay grade for sure. I really, really struggled with that. So there was that issue, the writing issue. There was also the professional issue. I was very worried about it being dismissed as fluffy or, too popular because it didn't begin with this book will argue and it didn't end with this book concludes. It was crafted to be, 1 minute you were in D-Yard, 1 minute you were in the governor's living room, and that was a choice that I was worried my colleagues would, not my immediate colleagues, but that the profession would dismiss. And in fact, the first versions of the book were really wonky. I mean, they read more like a policy brief probably than a narrative, and I had to, scrap it and start again and allow myself to actually tell a narrative. Now, all of that said, I had a really great editor who helped me tremendously. For example, the original draft of this book had every possible name of any person I ever found was named in the book because I'm a historian, and if I know it, you better know it. I'm going to tell you if I know it, I'm going to tell you it. And I remember the editor saying to me, look, if we are never going to hear from this person again, don't tell me their name, just identify them, for example, as a guard or as a prisoner or as a townsperson, because the blizzard of names it's obscuring the key people who you do want me to really follow and know about and focus on. And that was hugely helpful to me. Painful, but helpful. Same thing with the quotations. I had so many quotations, like, imagine so-and-so, had a breakfast of, quote, ham and eggs, unquote, because maybe I had gotten that from a particular diary or something. And, the editor was hugely helpful. He'd say, we trust you. We trust you that it was ham and eggs. You don't need quotation marks around ham and eggs because quotation marks slow the reader. They slow the eye. The point isn't the ham and the eggs, right? The point is that they had breakfast. I'm like, yes, you're right. But I did insist, of course, on footnotes because I am a scholar, and you'll notice that there's 200 plus pages, I think, of footnotes in the book. But they're there if you want to see where I got something. They're not there to overwhelm the piece. And all of that was way, way different than anything I'd ever done before. But it has led me, I will tell you, to be much more, with my own graduate students and colleagues. I'm that person now who says, make it engaging and make it readable, because if there's anybody out there right now in public discourse who should be doing this work, it should be historians, and we've got to make our writing readable.
Is there any advice that you give more frequently, maybe to grad students or to colleagues, in terms of changing something to make it more readable?
I'd have to think about that. I'm sure my students would answer better than I could on that. I think it's mostly that I really encourage folks to think about description more. If you're talking about something, we rely so heavily on footnotes rather than just telling what we actually know to be true. I've told this story before, but my agent, when I first did the book proposal, I was mentioning the key figure in the book, Big Black. And, he, of course, that was his moniker. He insisted people call him that. And she at one point said, well, can you tell me more about him? What did he look like and what did he sound like, And I was stymied. I said, well, I don't really know. And what I meant by that is I didn't have a footnote describing him. And she said, have you seen a picture of him? Have you heard him speak on tape? And of course, the answer was yes. And what I had never imagined was to have the confidence that I could tell you what he looked like.
Wow.
That I could be the footnote. And so those kinds of things I think I try to share those with students so that they feel a little bit more comfortable. But I'm acutely aware that their first book should not be a grand narrative if they want to get tenure, It is important. I will just say that's not a slam on the profession. It's really important in all of our disciplines, whether we're philosophy professors or English professors or historians. We must understand our discipline and do it well. There is a method, there is a methodology, and we need to know that, and we need to demonstrate it, and we need to do it really, really well, I think, before we turn our hand to making a more popular piece. Jason Stanley, for example, is a philosopher, and he is a brilliant philosopher and, can go toe to toe with the most intense philosophic methodological debates. He just wrote this new book on fascism, which is incredibly engaging and meant for a popular audience. And one of the reasons it works so well is because he's such a good philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, I think with history, and if you're an English professor, I mean, before one even would write an amazing novel, you have to be really, really good at being an English professor to really do that. I think that there's a reason to do both, and maybe it's about timing in one's career.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Were there any maybe scholars or books that you turned to thinking, if I could do it at least to some extent like this? Like, was there any motivating either figure or work that you turned to when you were writing your own?
I mean, there were so many beautiful writers. I've mentioned this to others before. I mean, you've got beautiful writers, Aaron Dottie Roy, and wonderful storytellers like Margaret Atwood, but you also have amazing historians that really make these powerful, powerful arguments like Kianga Taylor or Kelly Lytle Hernandez. And those are all people, and I wanted the book to somehow meld those worlds, to really pack a punch historiographically, but also to be well read. And I don't even hope to have done that the way that I wanted to do it, but the book allowed me, because the story has sort of told itself, to at least try.
Mm-hmm.
And the next book I'm working on is a similar type of story, which is about the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia in 1985, which has all these precursor events, namely the urban uprising in Philadelphia in 1964 and a major clash between the MOVE organization and Rizzo's police department in 1978. And then, of course, the bombing in 1985 that resulted in the Philadelphia police dropping a bomb on a MOVE house, which was a row house that subsequently not only killed men, women, and children, but burned down, an entire city block. That story, like Attica, has its own logic to it. What comes first, what comes second, what comes third. But like Attica, it also is a bit of a mystery. How does this happen? How does there no responsibility taken, except for the victims are the only ones that end up being forced to take responsibility? Who was behind it? Where was the government? Who were the players? Where did the bomb come from? The mystery element. But it does kind of have its own storytelling quality just because of what it is. And I tend to gravitate towards those. Perhaps because I'm not sure I could, so well create a beautiful narrative out of whole cloth.
When you're working on this next book, are there things that you would do now after this experience with Blood in the Water that you'll get to it right away because you realize it's more important than you realized? Or perhaps there are things that you won't waste time on that you did with the earlier project? What are you taking away from the first experience as you work on the next one?
So there's a lot I've thought about. I mean, one of the things that I wish that I would have done much earlier in the Attica project is to get a really clear timeline down. Actually, like as in this happens first, second, third, kind of a living timeline that I can add things and keep, understanding the whole structure of the story. I've actually started that right away, whereas I wasn't doing that till I was actually writing chapters in Attica, because it helps me to know what I don't know, right? If I know that this happens and then this happens now, then it raises questions about what happened in between, or who can I ask what happened, or where might there be a source? And I've also been, now technology has changed. I have a better note-taking software, a better scanning software, so I'm being more careful about my, to have a platform that I can search more easily.
Yeah, can I ask what you're using?
Yeah, without sounding like a shill for the company, since I have no stake in it, I use a program called Evernote.
Okay, yeah.
Which is this kind of amazing, for me, an amazing program because it allows you to set up your chapters in it and change them as your book changes, but to set them up. And then there's an app called Scannable, which works seamlessly with it, if you have an iPhone at least. It's a really amazing scanner that you don't have to fiddle with to, crop, and it just seamlessly zeroes in on your document and makes it searchable. And you can upload it immediately into that chapter you want it in, or multiple chapters, and those documents then are searchable, and it's really quite extraordinary. And Evernote has a web clip feature on it, which means that anytime you see something online, whether it's a source or whether it's a newspaper article or a photograph, you just click it and it automatically also pulls up your chapter and you can put it where it needs to go. So I would have killed for that the first time around. I have notes everywhere and in every possible nook and cranny of my life. So technology has made that, I hope, a little easier. But we'll see. It also has all the challenges of Attica. There's what the cops say happened. There's what the MOVE members say happened. There's what the neighbors say happened. And everybody believes fervently in their version of what happened. And they're all in their way. They're all human. They're all good people, right, to their own family members and in their own lives. And yet together, this horrendous thing unfolds. And it's about race, just as Attica was. It's about whose lives are more valuable than others. And when you do any project like that, you find yourself on a day-to-day basis feeling like 1 minute you're like, oh God, this, I see why they did this. The next minute, no, they're a horrendous person. And, you're constantly emotionally pulled from pillar to post. I got in the habit with Attica, and I think I'll have to with this one as well, of just telling everyone I talk to that I can't promise that I will tell this story the way that you would, but I do promise that I will honor your story. In other words, really try to take people for who they are, for how they see themselves. I think that's an important thing. People can do terrible things, but you don't really appreciate the impact of what they've done unless you fully understand how complicated they in fact are.
That's a great point. When you're faced with something that doesn't have material evidence and somebody says A happened and another person says B happened, how do you work with that?
Yeah.
Particularly when there isn't a sort of unbiased or third party that helps you elaborate?
Well, I think you'll notice that did come up a few times in the Attica book. First, I always do try to figure out any kind of documentary or any way that I can figure out what's more likely of an explanation, but oftentimes you can't. And so, I will say it exactly as you just did, which is that according to so-and-so, this is what happened. But notably, so-and-so saw it very differently and said that this is what happened. And I report it as it remains with me, which is that people see it very differently depending on their perspective. But it's a challenge. I had an incident in the Attica book that you'd have to read the notes very carefully to really see it. But I had a person tell me that they know for a fact that a guard killed L.D. Barkley, and that was because they had seen the L.D. Barkley's glasses on the mantle of this guard. And I was just stunned when I heard this story. And I spent many years trying to corroborate it, both with the records I found and also searching for the name of the person that they alleged and so forth. And at the end of the day, I could find no corroborating evidence. And that doesn't mean that didn't happen, but I could not name that person because I have zero of anyone else that said that person did that. And so, I reported it just as the way I described it, which is that there is an allegation that this has happened, but I didn't name who that person was.
Yeah.
Because I didn't feel that I had enough evidence to do that.
When you're working or maybe doing this timeline as you prepare, are you able to have a blank spot in which someone may or may not have done this, for example? Or, I understand when you're writing that you won't necessarily say it if you don't have that kind of evidence. But personally, do you find yourself coming out saying, like, I think this is what happened, but I won't write that for whatever reason?
Oh, yeah. There's no question that the evidence, sometimes it's only circumstantial, but you're human. So you think, my God, it seems pretty clear to me that this happened. But, that's why, remember what I said about how it's so important to know your method first. You've got to be a good historian before you do this, because the method matters. And if you're a good historian, you can't just say things because you think them or you feel them or you believe them. You have to have evidence for them. And you can't fit your evidence into your preconceived notion. It's not like writing a brief where you're marshaling evidence to make a point. Historians begin with the evidence and the point comes out of the evidence. So, yeah, you can feel it, but that doesn't come in your book because unless you can, you can show it. So, for example, in my book, I came across a lot of evidence of which state trooper tortured or shot, which inmate. And in the book, you'll notice this is not just wordsmithing. It's actually, again, goes to the core of what we do methodologically as historians. I never call anyone a murderer. What I say is, these are the people identified by the state of New York, and this is the evidence that they believed indicated that so-and-so had killed so-and-so. And then I will close the loop and say, and the state chose not to indict any of those people. Those are factual statements that, to be sure, you will draw the conclusion that the state felt that so-and-so had killed so-and-so and didn't indict them.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't say that those people killed so-and-so because I don't have the evidence of that, right?
When you're making that kind of decision, is it a legal question for you to some extent, like having a lawyer look at it? Or are you making it through an ethical lens? Or is there sort of your historian training that is helping you decide whether to assert something like murder?
Well, for me personally, it's first and foremost a methodological question because I would not ever feel comfortable writing a history book where I was playing fast and loose with the assertions and taking facts to fit my own desired outcome. I mean, I just could not do that. I wouldn't do that. So that's methodological. Meanwhile, of course, there is the fact, which is that when you write a book like this, you do have lawyers that vet it within an inch of their life. Mm-hmm. And so it also went through a legal vetting. And the good news is that lawyers also are very keen to have evidence to support statements. So between the two of us, nothing got in that book unless it had some corroborating evidence. I think our motivations were slightly different. I mean, I don't want to be sued, of course, but that was not my motivation. You know, again, it really does come from the methodology of being a historian.
I feel like you've probably come across this issue in either your teaching or in your research, but when you present these stories, particularly of repeated inhumane treatment, government cover-ups, intimidation in prisons physically and mentally and financially through the court system, it seems very, as we said earlier, it can make someone very pessimistic. It can be very depressing. There's also clearly you see a value in exposing this. If people are wondering, like, why should they read this? Why should they go back to this sad tale in American history? Do you have a sort of response that you might give?
Well, I think that there's two things I want to say. One is that I hope that reading a book like this, I hope people will read a book like this because I think it really encourages us all to keep digging to find out what really happened, whether it's in our past or in our present. Mm-hmm. It encourages a healthy skepticism, which I think we are in desperate need of right now, to encourage freedom of the press, for example, to encourage access to documents, to encourage open transparency from, government officials. I mean, I think that this is it's very timely that we should encourage all of us to really want to dig deeply into any source we're given. But I think for Attica specifically, I want people to read it because I think that one of the things that I discovered, and it really was at least very powerful to me, was I had never really understood. I knew that we had started a war on crime in 1965 with Johnson, and I knew that that had a lot to do with a backlash to the civil rights movement, and I understood that. But what I really could never understand as a citizen was the incredible punitive spirit that had gripped our country, certainly by the 80s and into the 90s. What was it that had made us as a nation so punitive that we thought it was okay to lock up children for life sentences without parole, or that we began handing out life sentences, period, indiscriminately, or that we brought the death penalty back, or that we didn't care that people were languishing for decades in solitary confinement. And that was a real question for me because I knew that in the late 60s and early 70s, when you look at the polling data, people were, in fact, quite sympathetic to the idea that the incarcerated had human rights. We had gotten rid of the death penalty. There's a sense in which oftentimes, a very grudging sense that civil rights did matter, that they were at the core of our democracy. And somehow we had become just virulently punitive. And I wanted to understand that. And the thing that Attica does is it shows you that when we get the stories wrong of what really happened in key clashes between the people, and in this case, law enforcement, the consequences of it are very, very dire and lasting. So, you think about it this way, whether it was Kent State or Attica or the Democratic Convention of 68 or Orangeburg or Wounded Knee, any of these huge moments in the period of the 60s and 70s in which students or prisoners or Native groups or African Americans in the South were asking and demanding to be part of this democracy, for basic rights under this democracy. And the response in all of those cases was excessive state violence. And yet somehow we come out of that period asking for more police, deciding that hippies are violent, prisoners are animals, native population should be put back on the reservation, etc. And how does that happen? And Attica really shows that in part it's because we didn't get the story out as it had really happened. In fact, in Attica, they actually lied about what happened and said that the prisoners had killed the hostages. And at Kent State, the press around the anti-war protesters was so vile that it didn't even matter anymore that they were unarmed when they were gunned down. And so storytelling matters. It shapes the future. It shapes our political consciousness. And so that's why I hope people will read this book, because that really drives that point home, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an excellent way to wrap up this whole discussion, is the importance of looking at this one situation very closely, as you have done. And I encourage everyone to check out Blood in the Water if they haven't, but also thinking about how that relates to these greater social contexts that we continue to see the repercussions of on a daily basis. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Heather. I really appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much. I mean, those were great questions, and it really, I think, invited a great discussion. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you again for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast. As a reminder, this is the season finale. We're going to go on a brief hiatus and return at the beginning of August. And I already have some really amazing interviews completed, some lined up, and others in the works. If you're interested, check out tinap.org to see what's coming, and also, of course, what we've already had. All of the authors leave their book recommendations. They might be things you want to check out. And if you like what you're hearing and you want to support it, best thing you can do is send the word, let people know, share, post, review, and send me a note. Of course, financial donations are also very welcome. No matter what, I really appreciate you listening. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.